Good afternoon. I think I'd like to we'll now start the talk by Professor Martin Jones. We're most honored to have Professor Martin Jones here to give us a talk about food in prehistory. Professor Martin Jones is the Pitt Rivers Professor of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. His field in archaeology the topic is food, but he's actually connecting it with genetics. So we have archaeology connected with genetics, and he works on food, farming in prehistory, farming techniques. Today I think he's going to talk on a very interesting topic, that is the transmission of grain crops. So how wheat and other grain crops which originated in the West, we're sort of talking about the one belt, one road idea. Wasn't called that in archaeology, but just to help you to understand that you have this transmission between east and west of food crops in a very early period. So we have food crops which came from the west, wheat, barley, rye, that went to the east. Then we have food crops such as millets, common millet, foxtail millet, rice, and also buckwheat, which some of you might know as soba, Japanese soba. How these crops were transmitted in ancient times. And this is, Professor Jones has a team of people at Cambridge who do this, and they've actually been going all over China. He actually has some students of his in China who are archaeologists trained by Professor Jones. So he is working very closely with archaeologists within China to do this research, and expands all over the north of China, northwest of China. I think I'll, at the moment, stop there for fear of making any mistake in the introduction. So I'd like to call upon Professor Jones to begin his talk. The talk is, as you can see, Food Globalization in Prehistory. Martin,
thanks very much. Thanks very much. Well, thank you, Christian, for that warm introduction and for inviting me. Another way that I introduce myself is that a normal archaeologist digs up beautiful things and finds great temples, whereas I've made a career out of digging up garbage, and which I think is much more interesting, and I hope I can persuade you too. And the other thing is that I'm well aware that you're not a group of archaeologists, but don't worry, because actually the stuff that I do is quite strange for a number of archaeologists. So the expert, and part of what I want to do is to share with you the kind of methods that we've put together to find this stuff, as well as to tell you the story that's engaged me for the last decade or so. And the two pictures behind me illustrate that story rather well. What these two pictures behind me are of two sets of women who in different parts of the world are celebrating spring. And they're celebrating spring in the same way that their mothers and grandmothers and so on have done since time immemorial. And on the left-hand side, I'll just pick this up so I can get my pointer. On the left-hand side, you have women from North China who are preparing huamo, these very light, fluffy, and beautifully decorated bread buns to celebrate the spring. And on this side are women from West Russia who are celebrating spring with these blinis, which are gold and round like the sun. And as I say, these are deep-seated traditions in these two areas. And the puzzling thing about them is that in order to get these white, fluffy rolls, what you need to use is wheat, and a particular type of wheat that was originated over in West Asia, where these ladies live. And in order to get those gold round pancakes, you need to use buckwheat, which is a crop from China. And so there's this rather puzzling thing that sometime in the past, there's been this exchange, and quite significant exchange of crops, and it's not something that we knew much about until the kind of things I'm going to tell you about today. This is something that a problem that has engaged me, and it's the problem that brought me to this wonderful part of the world in the first place. So I'm rather glad that that problem existed. Now, of course, there are ideas about how these crops might have moved around. If one talks about east and west across Eurasia, one immediately thinks about ideas like the Silk Road, which is largely a sort of medieval thing that goes back about 2,000 years in the records. And there's something about how Western scholars think about that, which I illustrate in the next slide. On the top left-hand corner, sorry? Is this working? Okay. And on the top left-hand corner, you have the man associated with the Silk Road, Marco Polo. And the only reason I show this is to show that when in the West we thought about those ideas, there's always a lot of arrows going from the West to the East. And the general mindset of Western scholars has been, if there's some link across Eurasia, it's because Western civilizations are driving the process and creating those linkages. And so when the first archaeologists who could see evidence of deep-seated linkages between East and West, they did the same thing. And down on the bottom right, you have Yuan Fuli, who is a pioneer Chinese archaeologist, and Johan Gunnar Andersen, who is a Danish originally geologist, but they're standing on the famous Neolithic site of Yangshao, which they discovered and excavated back in the 1920s. And when they did so, what Andersen discovered is that the kinds of pottery that you found in these Neolithic sites in Yangshao had a superficial resemblance to these kinds of potteries which come from East Europe. And so again, within the pottery, there was a sense that back in the Neolithic, there were these connections. Now, I've said just back in the Neolithic because at the time that Fuli and Andersen were working on this, there wasn't any scientific dating methods. And so it was just back in the Neolithic some time ago, and there wasn't any precise form of dating. And so in the context of that Western mindset, again, the assumption was, well, this must be Western civilization initiating civilization in the East. So there are those mindsets in the West that if you have any linkages, it's basically the West civilizing the East. Now, the figure that who turned that around was Joseph Needham, who we can see up here on the right, who wrote this whole series of volumes on science and civilization in China, and came out here in the 1940s. He was very interested in what he saw in China about developments that you couldn't explain in this way, and forms of technology and so forth, where the East could have, it's best explained that the East had their own indigenous story. And so, although the broad mindset was very much, if you've got context, it must be West affecting East. From Needham onwards, we've had a sort of context in which there's a sense that both the East and West have some autonomy in change and development. And that's something that, as you'll see, resonates with the kind of findings that has come out of my project. Now, if I put myself in the picture, there you have, as Christian said, me in China, and I'm there with the plant that brought me to China. That's broomcorn millet in there, and it's seeds of this plant that brought me to China in the first place, and this is one of the crops that is at a very early stage moving from east to west. So I want to tell you a bit in detail about the kind of work that I do and the projects I was doing and how I was drawn to China and to explore patterns in the crop. So, well, here's me at a rather younger stage in my life, around 40 years ago, when we were exploring new ways, as I say, for doing an archaeology of garbage. And essentially, this is a late prehistoric pit that if you just dig with conventional tools, you can find pots and bones and so forth. But you don't see something that's absolutely critical in terms of the human past, that you only see when you actually mix it with water and pour it through a sieve, and then look down a microscope at it. And these are remains of charred cereals. And before the late 60s, no one was doing this, and so we didn't really have any idea about the place of cereals in the prehistoric past. And so back in the 60s and 70s, one of the first bits of work that I did was to look at a whole bunch of burnt cereal grains from prehistoric sites in Europe to piece together ideas about what people were farming and what people were growing in Europe. So back then, absolutely nothing to do with China at all. As things progressed, a whole bunch of other methods came into play that were could also be very valuable in telling us about early farming, early agriculture, and early plants generally. And that was plant genetics. Now, genetics was not new in that point. Well, genetics was quite new, obviously. It's something that's developed since the 1950s. But one of the things that was happening about the 1980s and 1990s, well, two things were happening. On the one hand, there were technologies whereby it became very easy to look at genetic diversity. So you could take a series of, in this case, barley grains from different fields, and you could see there's a bit of genetic diversity in their colour, and you could plot it precisely and get these similarity diagrams here. So each of these is what we call a land race, an accession of barley from one particular point in space. And these tree diagrams are similarity diagrams. And also about the same time in the 1890s, it became clear that you could also find bits of DNA in ancient material, such as these ancient barley grains from archaeological sites. Now, before the genetic diversity patterns came together, what I think everyone expected would be that the DNA sequences in any of these genomes would be something like a technical library. It'd be full of books whereby you could, with useful information in about how you built features on plants or animals. And I've come to the conclusion that now that we've got those genomes described, they're rather more like my Cambridge office that I've been in for the last 27 years, which is also full of text and paperwork, and a small proportion of that is useful stuff. A large proportion of it is something that my colleagues would describe as junk, but I have a sense that it may have some function, although I can't articulate it. But the really interesting thing is how much of that genetic information is historic. So just like my office, one of the key bits of information it has is the history of Martin Jones. And the same thing is true of genetic diversity. So if you take the genetic diversity in these barley plants and plot it in these tree diagrams, a lot of the information is about the origins of that barley and where it comes from. And so these trees are actually historical patterns of barley being domesticated in the Near East, and then different branches moving out the different parts of the landscape. So back in the 80s and 90s, that was a really exciting development, that one could draw on DNA to get a much richer idea of how our agriculture and crops worked in the past. In other fields that I'm not talking about, it would produce an equally rich idea of how people moved around and how animals moved around. So just as genetics has changed many of the subjects we study, genetics over the last 20 years or so has transformed our approach to archaeology. And so back in the 80s, 90s, at that stage I'd done about 20 years or something with my flotation and looking and getting hold of charred remains. I was part of a group that thought we've got to test these new genetic possibilities and take those trees in the last diagram and see how much precision we could get in terms of how agriculture works in the past. So what we did was we took a story that was very well attested with lots of data, not just plant data, but also archaeological sites and pottery and so forth. And that was the spread of agriculture across Europe. And all sorts of bits of data suggested this is the sort of time scale in which it spreads across Europe. And also, there are essentially two routes by which farming from the Near East got across Europe. One of those routes was going along these coastlines. And another of these routes was essentially tracking up the big river valleys across Europe. And as I say, there's a whole bunch of sites to attest that. So what we thought we'd do is we gather masses of all the data we could, both archaeobotanically and also genetically, and see whether genetic diversity could pick up the pattern that we already knew from the archaeobotany. Now, as part of that, we did a metadata survey, a massive survey of all of the crop records that had been published for Europe. So at this stage, you've had at least 20 years of lots of people doing flotation and a lot of publications of plant lists across Europe. And the predominant two plants, no surprise, were the major two. Is it we all right? The predominant plants were the major two crops that were spreading across Europe, which were a form of wheat, emmer wheat, and six-row barley. So that was unsurprising. The interesting thing is, amongst those crops, there were also much smaller quantities of two plants, which in each site only occurred in small numbers, and so hadn't been taken much notice of. But once one looked at a map of Europe, they were occurring in different countries in many different places. And they were two species of millet and buckwheat. And the interesting things about those is if you asked a botanist about those taxa, they would say, well, they're essentially Chinese taxa. So in this project that had nothing to do with China, to test out genetic methods, we started seeing that there were a small but recurrent pattern of Chinese crops very early on in the European archaeological record, way before anything that we might call the Silk Road. And so that's what took me to China. Now, just to put it together, this is a publication. Of what was actually in print by 2008 for one of these particular crops, and that's broomcorn millet, or well, broomcorn and foxtail millet, and the red ones are specific ones of broomcorn millet. And these are the things that were published by that period, and this is one of those Chinese plants. And as you can see, in publications, the great majority were in the wrong place. There's only, there's only a few where the botanist would say broomcorn millet came from, and masses in the wrong place. Now this is, as you can imagine, an artifact of where the data have been gathered. As I mentioned, the key source of this data is a whole bunch of people doing flotation, just as I was doing in that early slide. In the early 2000s, flotation wasn't really being done that much in China. So this is an artifact of that effect. But nonetheless, back in a few years before this publication, myself and one of my young colleagues, Liu, traveled out to China. We traveled out to this site in particular to try and get a sense of what the information was in this plant and why the archaeological data was the wrong way around. Now, the period, as we went, in fact, once we already set up where we were going and so forth, we heard through the grapevine and conferences of a Chinese colleague who's since then been a colleague for us and continued, Professor Zhao Jijun, who had started doing flotation on a large scale in China, and he was absolutely transforming the picture of crops in China. So Zhao Jijun was one of that generation of post-Cultural Revolution students who'd gone to train in America, and he trained with a very good archaeobotanist in America, and come back and just been in a position to start doing lots of flotation and change that record. And so on the one hand, he found lots more Brunkul millet, and in this case, in the right place and in quantity. And you can see some of his Brunkul millet there in different periods of time, gradually getting bigger. In addition to that, just as we in the West were finding traces of Brunkul millet and buckwheat in our samples, he was turning up wheat and barley going back to at least 4,500 years. So by the time we got out to China, the picture has changed. That in both sides of Eurasia, crops were moving around very early on. And I want to show you where these millet grains come from, which is one of the sites that Zhao Jijun excavated, and that's Xinglonggo in Inner Mongolia. And the main reason, there you see a Neolithic settlement there. There's the location. And here's some of the Xinglonggo millet grains, large quantities of them. But the main reason I want to show you this slide is to show you a location in the landscape that's going to be very important in subsequent slides. And what this location in the landscape is, the break between the solid geology there, where the soils are quite shallow, to where the soils pile up to a deeper, good depth below. So this is, in this case, windbone loess. It can be a mixture of loess and alluvium, piling up to get that break between the shallow soil and hard rock and the deeper soil. And this break on the foothills is clearly precisely where a lot of early agriculture was, and a lot of the communities that were engaged in that exchange. And you'll see that more clearly in later slides. But I just wanted to give you a sense of that whole location. So, as I mentioned, one of the things that brought me to this was exploring new ways of looking at genetics to elaborate the story. And what I want to do now is take you through a series of the methodological approaches that we put together to try and piece together what was happening back in the Neolithic, such that these crops were moving around. And so, first of all, if we start off with the genetics, which was quickly moving into a methodology that could work for us. And here's two of my geneticist colleagues, Harriet Hunt and Diane Lister, who've done terrific work on this. Harriet has done work on millet moving west and dye on wheat and barley moving east. And there's a series of different things we use for this. Harriet in the greenhouse there has, in each of these pots, what we call a landrace. And I'll just elaborate a bit more on what a landrace is. When we travel around Asia and we find an interesting crop that we want to take a sample of, we ask the farmers where they got their seed from. And there tends to be two types of answers. One is, I got it from this company, this agricultural company, and two, I got it from my family or my brother or my cousin. And if it's the latter, if it's the first, then you just get part of the global market. There's not much information there. If it's the latter, we call that a land race, and it has been quite surprising how much historic information one can get from these land races. So in each of these pots are land races of millet, and this might be a land race from Turkey, this one here a land race from North China, this one from Sichuan, and so forth. So they each have a location, and genetic diversity information. Going a bit older, we've also got a lot of information from historic specimens. So these are crops that were collected in the last century, and they've been nicely preserved on herbarium sheets. And I mentioned them because, as I say, the land races preserve a great deal of information, but the 20th century has seen a lot of change and noise in the landscape, and if one just goes back before the 20th century, as one can do from things like herbarium sheets, then the information is much crisper. And from these two sets of data, we build hypotheses from the genetic diversity, and the next slide will show how that works, about the spread. And then we go to a third category of data to test that hypothesis. So the hypothesis might say, well, if we've got it right, then this crop spread across Eurasia in the Bronze Age, and so by the middle of the second millennium BC, it should look like this. And these are from archaeological sites. These are desiccated grains. This particular site from Western China is 4,000 years old. And in these desiccated grains, the DNA is good enough to check that hypothesis. So we use land races and historic DNA to build hypotheses, and then archaeological DNA, ancient DNA, to test them. So that's Harriet and Dyer with their millet and barley. Let's have a look at the kind of results they get. Typically what the results look like is this, and what each one of those circles is a land race, one of the pots you've just seen in the greenhouse, and the colours relate to the genetic signature. So if there are geneticists in the audience, these sort of lines will make some sort of sense, but for others of you, just accept those are measures of genetic diversity. And you can see that I've put these ellipses around the genetic diversity groups across there. And with the exception of the blue group, all of those ellipses intersect in the same place where Professor Zhao and colleagues were finding the earliest, richest records of this crop. So putting those two together, one can see that how one can explain that diversity is that the millets millet farming originated in this part of North China, and each of these coloured lobes is a different movement away from that area across the world. And so there's a number of movements within East Asia, and 3 westward, 2 of which are stretching right across to East Europe, where by the historic period there are strong millet traditions. So it gives you a feel for the kind of one element of the things you can get with genetics, and I'll unfold some other things one can get to genetics in due course. In a similar way, this is the eastward spread of barley through exactly the same thing. Each of these circles is a haplotype, and you can see, I haven't put ellipses around these, but you can see pathways of spread from the origin of barley domestication in Southwest Asia, both below and above the Himalayan uplift, and reaching out to China, Korea, and Japan. And again, one can start piecing these together and get general pictures from the genetics of how these crops spread across. And the interesting thing too, I mean, one of the things that I'll move towards is who is spreading these and what sorts of communities are spreading them. The thing I wanted you to notice from this slide is it's not a single route. There are different forms of wheat and barley going different ways. So it's not a singular trade route or something. It's a number of communities involved in moving sometimes the same crops through different pathways across Eurasia. Now, I want also to talk a bit about, so the genetics can give you these broad hypotheses of movement. The nice thing about genetics too is it can also say some things about what's happening with the plants. So the kind of genetic diversity that was used to get those spreads is not the kind of, it's the kind of DNA that, in the analogy with my office, could be described as junk. It's not the DNA that has a clear function. It's just this, the junk DNA is particularly good for showing the pathways of spread. But we can also study the genes that relate to an actual function. And there's two types of function that have proved very interesting. One of them is ecological and tells us about how the new landscapes that these crops have moved into. But the other one tells us more about the people, and that's culinary and about cooking traditions. And what I've shown in this slide is a contrasting cooking tradition that we will be familiar with in terms of the modern world, but quite surprisingly seems to remain robust back to the origins of agriculture and beyond to what we describe as the Upper Paleolithic, the Stone Age. And so there are, from various forms of archaeological evidence and sometimes quite conventional evidence like grinding stones and pots and so forth, we can see that cooking traditions are very deep-seated. And the cooking traditions that these ones show is that in the West, the way one works with grains and has worked with grains is to grind them up into flour, mix them with at least water, sometimes yeast, and put them in an open fire, if you like, roast them to create kind of roasted bread and so forth. And it's interesting that the same tradition applies with meat, that there's a strong roasting tradition in the West. In the East, as you know far better than I, there are a whole series of wet whole grain cuisines, sometimes sticky cuisines, that both involve some form of container because they're wet and sticky, and also tools for picking up wet and sticky food. And so, not surprisingly, in that context, it's in the East that you get really ancient pottery. You don't need it in the West. And so this pot, for example, is around 18,000 years old from Yuchanyan in China, whereas pottery is more recent than agriculture in the West. And here's another slide to again elaborate on that wet, sticky, whole grain cuisine in the East. On the one hand, as I say, you have these ancient pots. You have pots that are clearly for steaming. This is from much more recent times, 4,000 years old. Here's what are claimed to be the earliest noodles in the world from the site of Laja. And the other very interesting thing is you don't need tools to pick up food in the West, and all the technology for not touching wet, sticky food comes from the East. Obviously the chopsticks, but the same with forks. So here is the oldest forks that I know of. They are from this culture. They're 4,000 years old, made, and that may well be a knife and fork. And it's not until several thousand years later that you get forks in the West. And interestingly, by this period, they're very much associated with consuming foods that come from the East. So a whole bunch of different culinary traditions. Now, how that relates to genetics is some of that stuff doesn't have a genetic link, but interestingly, the stickiness does. The stickiness relates to a gene that affects the starch balance in the crops, and that applies to all sticky cereals. And we can study the gene that controls stickiness using the same data we use to look at the spread of millet. So here you have precisely the same Harriot's different spreads of millet, but I've only left on the ellipses when there are genes for stickiness. And so those are the three groups in which you have, and again, it doesn't matter for those who don't know the genetics on this, that's a gene that confers stickiness. And not surprisingly, there's a number of haplogroups in the East that confer stickiness. The really interesting one is this yellow one here, where you get sticky genes over in the West. And the interesting thing is, although these land races have that sticky gene, it's not expressed. It's rather like the genes that all of us have to make a tail. They're there, but they're not expressed. And in the same way as the tail reflects ancestry and evolutionary history, what this reflects is before these crops came to the West, their ancestors were once sticky, but because stickiness doesn't work in the West, they were selected against and it got buried. So by looking at genes for stickiness, one can confirm what the archaeological evidence already suggests, that although crops are moving around, which suggests some dynamism, culinary traditions are very traditional. Here's another example of the same thing. Some of the crops in the West that are good for grinding. If you're grinding, then a big fat grain is really good. If you have that whole grain culinary tradition, especially if it's steamed or something, you don't want the grains that big, and typically, as you know, a lot of steamed whole grains are rather smaller. And so just as the stickiness is selected out, you can see exactly the same thing happening with the grain size. Here's the wheat grains from the West, and in the East, the wheat grains are sometimes half the size. And this is just measuring the charred grains that come from the flotation samples. And here's a series of different geographical regions. It's easier to see on this. These are the same data. This is just compressed into means and standard errors. But if you go from West Asia, you have these big grains in West Asia, and they get smaller in Central Asia until you get to the central plains of China, when they're half the size or left. So this is just from conventional visual microscopy. In the same way as the stickiness is selected out one way, then the grain size is selected out the other way. So again, what we can see from the genetic evidence and the fossil evidence is that there is this movement early on, but the culinary traditions are very conservative. And so as cereals move from west to east, you have naked cereals preferred, and that's another thing in relation to whole grain cuisine. The size of grains is reduced, and something I haven't mentioned so far, but several Western cereals adopt a sticky form in the East. So there are actually sticky forms of most cereals, including sticky rye, sticky barley. With the movement east to west, you have the sticky genes silenced, and then you have these eastern crops folded into a new cuisine that involves grinding them up, mixing them with water, and doing the Western thing. So, mobile crops, conservative cuisine. Now I want to move, that's one element of looking at the genetics. As I said, we draw on a whole series of methodologies that are unfamiliar with in archaeology. Another one of them is looking at stable isotopes. Now, if we take carbon, there are three isotopes of carbon. One, carbon-14, is unstable, and has been really important as archaeology's major dating method. And the other two are stables, carbon-12 and carbon-13, and the balance between them reflects diet. And if we look at how plants use their carbon, the majority of plants are what are called C3 plants, including all these red cereals here. And that's just the norm of photosynthesis within plants. There's a set of plants that take that normal photosynthesis and add what I would describe as a turbocharger to kind of heat up the photosynthetic pathway. And the reason they do that is they work well for plants that occur where there's a lot of sunlight, but water may be stressed. And in those circumstances, this kind of turbocharger is quite advantageous. And they're called C4 plants. And the significant, and I've put some, you can see both the millets are C4 plants. And the significance here is those two forms of plants fix carbon in different proportions and have different isotopic signatures, which we can pick up thousands of years later, not just in the plants, but also in the humans or animals that ate the plants, and also in the humans that ate the animals that ate the plants. So it's a really good way of exploring not just what's moving around, but who's eating it. And I've mentioned wheat and barley moving west and the millets moving east, and you'll see they're different colours, and so we can use isotopic methods to get a sense of who's eating what. So here's some of my group in a more or less 4,000-year-old cemetery in the Hershey Corridor, which is not surprisingly one of the main avenues for East-West movement. And you can see it's got these whole series of skeletons in. And Emma Lightford and Jin Li Liu are two of my colleagues who do this isotopic work. And the key thing they're asking is, okay, we know from both the genetics and the crop remains, millet and barley and wheat and so forth, moving backwards and forwards. We want to know who's eating them. Is there, you know, some of these graves are elite graves with nice finds in them. Is it the elite that are eating exotic things and the common people not? Is it everyone eating them? And so we can ask, by looking at these, the isotopic measure, we can find out what they ate and work out what's happening. So I'll just take you through the kind of things that have found. Now this is who's eating millet. And each of these dots is a cemetery or a group of human remains of a certain date. And there's white, grey and black dots. And the time period here is the 3rd millennium BC. And so the ones with white dots are eating predominantly millets. They're eating a lot of millet, and such that the carbon isotopes in their bones are really right over there. And you can see all of these white dots in just the right area in North China, and precisely where Zhao Jijun is finding the early sites. So that all makes sense. The interesting thing about this, on the black dots, they're all the wheat ones. These ones over here are rice. So it's you know, the isotopes don't give us an exact time. So the rice is black and the wheat is black. Interestingly, there's 3 dots here where some of the population is eating millet. So you can start seeing in the 3rd millennium BC this sort of trickle effect. And this isn't, they just have one taste of millet, they're eating enough millet so that it transforms the isotopic balance in their bones. Going forward 1,000 years, you can see it changes. You still have millet in the right place, but now you have a number of grey dots and also a few white dots. So it's kind of unfolding into something where certain communities are emphasizing the exotic crop. And so that is quite interesting. And you know, in the historic period, we can find those communities. Now, let's go back to the Hershey Corridor, and this is just a sort of almost a tourist shot, but we're back on the Hershey Corridor in China, which is this corridor between the mountains and the desert, along which a lot of this movement happened. And another set of isotopic. And along this corridor, we've had a number of cemeteries around that date, and also done isotopic work on them. Now, these are a series of sites, and those figures show the dates, and those are the isotopic results. Now, I realise that doesn't make much sense at the moment, so what I'll do is I'll just put a line on it so you can see what's happening. On the one hand, they form two groups that are very clear. All of the crosses and triangles are purely millet, and if you look at the date, they're all before 1800 BC. And all of the circles, diamonds, and squares are eating millet with a significant amount of wheat and barley, and they're all the ones after 1800 BC. So whereas the millet is trickling through east to west, the wheat and barley is coming like a tidal wave down the Hershey Corridor around 1800 BC. That's not the earliest wheat and barley in the east, so there are earlier finds of wheat and barley in the east, but nonetheless there's this clear agricultural revolution of kinds whereby wheat and barley is really coming down as an impact. So that's what the isotopes can do, and then the whole thing is kind of tied together in terms of those broad patterns you get from genetics and isotopes. The way you pin it down to places and dates is back to the basic method of flotation, finding these charred grains, which you can also directly date, and they're the ones in the end that that actually tie it down on the ground. And I've just made the point, it's not just a number of different groups have been doing flotation, and I've just mentioned here's Robert Spender and Michael Frachetti from Washington, St. Louis, who've done a terrific amount of flotation in Central Asia, and there you can see some wheat, barley, and millet. So that's the kind of thing you get a direct date on and start piecing together a story. Now, when Zhao Jijun, and you remember he's my Chinese colleague who started finding wheat and barley in the east, speculated on what routes that might be relevant. He's speculated on three routes. You've got a sea route there, the northern steppe route, the forest steppe edge, where a lot of the kind of early metallurgy and horse movement was happening, and then a kind of central route hugging the mountain corridor. So these were three possibilities, and fortunately, because over the last 10 years a number of different groups have been doing flotation, we can start talking about them. So my own group was, and some other groups explored this northern route. And the interesting thing is they are using plants, but not the cereals that moved around. So the northern route is out of it in the early stage. And my former student and colleague Dorian Fuller mounted this sea links project, which showed that the sea route is very interesting. One of the interesting things about the sea route is that at this time African crops are getting to India as well as Asian crops moving around there. So the sea route was really interesting. And the one that was actually fascinating is the inner Asian mountain corridor. And if you think back to Xinglonggo, that break between the hard geology and the foothills, if you extend that across Asia, that's clearly where a lot of the movement was happening. And so in a sense, this if you like, is the answer. I say it's the answer. It's a map that we keep redrawing as new bits of evidence come. But essentially, if you piece all of that evidence together of the crops and the isotopes and the genetics, this is the picture of food globalization we get by the early second millennium BC. And so African millets and sorghum coming to India, wheat and barley going in both directions, rice moving around here, and the Asian millets moving all the way around there. So by the early second millennium BC, significantly before you get elite goods moving around. All of these agricultural crops are moving around together. And one of the things about hugging those foothills is it's not the locus of agriculture we think of as agriculture today. So one of the things about hugging the foothills is the big river valleys and floodplains which are traditionally associated with agriculture, like the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Nile, the Euphrates. They're actually secondary, and these foothill locations are primary. And this area, which is on the Tian Shan in Xinjiang province, the area of Balikun, is an example where you can actually see that in that if you see these lines here, so, well, first of all, this is today, it's grassland, and you can see a group of ethnic Kazakh tents up there who are moving around on the grassland. But in the humps and the bumps in the fields, you can see ancient fields that are actually Bronze Age. So these are the kind of landscapes of farms hugging the foothills that you can see, and they're being excavated by colleagues in Lanzhou at the moment. We always get the opportunity, if we have the opportunity, to get the chance to talk to elderly farmers. There's an enormous amount of wisdom there, and Mr. and Mrs. Zhu here, who look quite sprightly even though they're in their 90s, were a source of great information about how you work these foothills, and they can remember back before the Cultural Revolution, back before everything, to how you used to farm these things. And one of the interesting things is they talked about the great thing about these foothills is not only is there water all year round, but they're all in small streams, and you don't have to have a complicated social contract to use the water. In the big rivers, you clearly need a social contract to get some of the water. And they were talking about how you could take some stones up the hill to channel the water down to their plot. And I remember they said, we can use, donkeys for that, or if it gets, or sometimes we use goats. And if you think, why on earth are you using goats as a pack animal to take stones uphill? And it starts to make sense when you realise they're going right up to where the water is melting from the snow and ice and managing it from there. So although as you go up altitude, it gets colder, the water is more reliable, and you don't have to negotiate with anybody else to get it. So that was very interesting. So that foothills moving upwards, on the one hand, it highlighted that we need to think of this in the vertical dimensions as well as the normal map dimension. In a sense, this early food globalization was a sort of centrifugal effect around the Himalayan uplift, where communities were moving up to there, exchanging crops, and then coming down into places like the Central Plain. And interestingly, as one explored that, it's clearly they were moving up and up. And I had the great opportunity to work with colleagues in Lanzhou, Dashui, on the northeast Tibetan plateau, and where one could follow the crops moving up into the Tibetan plateau, and all of these red dots are flotation sites where there are crops. And here's some of the crops that you find. Again, the western crops, wheat and barley, and the eastern crops, millet. Now, here's another diagram, which is a bit of a, doesn't make much sense to start off, but what you've got there is, first of all, I should say, time goes this way. So this is ancient and this is recent. And as these two are a temperature curve, so you can see environmental change here and a dip in temperature there. And these dots all relate to flotation and samples of what are now familiar for cereals, foxtail, broomcorn, barley and wheat. Now, to help it make sense, I'm going to overlay it with the result of something I just told you about. There's the timeline when that tide of wheat and barley consumption moved along the Hershey corridor, and we can see it from the isotopic evidence. And as we move up that timeline, you can see most of the circles are red and blue. They're the eastern crops, broomcorn and foxtail millet, and the farming is only going up. This is altitude. The farming is only going up to about 2,500 meters. Before the tide line, you can see some light blue dots, which are barley, and after the tide, you can see a green dot, which is wheat. And then 200 years after that tide effect, you can see the barley enables agriculture to go way up, up above 3,500 meters. So one of the things you can see happening is this move upwards as globalization happens. So that was quite an interesting thing. And the interesting too is the movement upwards in altitude is happening as the temperature is getting colder, which emphasizes, again, the key thing is water security. Right from way back, cold is not a limiting issue. Well, I'm going to come back to genetics now. I mentioned that within the genetics, one can look at culinary genes, and they're quite interesting. But the ecological genes are also very interesting. And if you imagine moving these crops around the landscape, the plants are getting into ecosystems which are completely different from the ones to which they're adapted. And some of their genes are going to be and not work. And one of the key sets of genes that this is true of is genes associated with seasonality. Now, for things like germination and flower initiation, as we know, plants do it at the right time because they're picking up signals from day length, light, and so forth. And that's why spring is spring, rather than things germinate all year round. And that works if you're in the right day length, and it stops working if you move to the wrong place. So you have something like millet or barley in its right place, and it's adapted to that sequence. But as it moves to the wrong place, something else happens. And although the main focus is moving across Asia, to study this one, we started off by looking at a north-south transect in Europe, in Scandinavia. And here you've got these are actually crops that were grown in the Arctic Circle in the last century. But what you have there is a series of different locations at different latitudes, and where the flowering season ideally should be. And you can see if you're a barley plant used to the day length, so you trigger flowering in March, it simply ain't going to work as you move north. So what happens to the plants? Well, we can see what happens to the plants by looking at some of the genes. This is a gene that allows barley to respond to the right season, and when the gene is working, it's green, and if you throw in a mutation and switch the gene off so it's just not working, then it's blue. And you can see both from the contemporary land races and the historic sections, but very clearly in the historic sections, as you move up beyond this latitude, it works by switching the genes off. So it's not like the plant gets a new seasonality, it just has a mutation that wipes that gene out, and so the plant becomes more dependent on humans to grow in the right season, because it has no mechanism itself to get its germination right. So the switching off of genes is a very interesting aspect of food globalization. If we move to the globalization picture, this is the same gene, but on a map of of the whole of the old world. These are two haplotypes, two types of genetic expression of the landrace, where that gene is switched off. And one of them is the square, and the other one is the triangle. Now, if we take that latitudinal line where they need it switched off, you can see it's a different switch. It's a different switch off in the west and the east. It's separate mutations that have allowed that. And if one goes back to this map, what's essentially happening is as these things move around, they're probably acquiring the mutations for a different seasonality and high altitude. And having got that, once they've got that gene switched off, then they can strike out north and spread in different places. So the journey across Eurasia has led to a bunch of switched off genes, and that is something that is quite significant in terms of the long-term consequence of this. So before talking about long-term consequences, I just want to summarize the main points that come out of the food globalization project. First of all, crops are moving in all directions well before elite goods. So more and more what we think this is ordinary farming communities in the foothills and probably neighbour to neighbour exchange, and it's a subsequent consequence that those become trade routes for elite goods. It's not the trade routes that are stimulating this. And as this movement happens, these culinary traditions stay absolutely stubborn, and so as the crops come into a new area, they're hanging in with the same culinary traditions and changing the crops to fit them into that. And then this interesting thing about, in different ways in different places, genes are getting switched off in order to allow the crops to grow in a new area. And then, as a result, local and exotic crops come together in several distinct regions. Now, in the last few slides, I just want to look at the consequences of those effects by seeing what happens in the subsequent period. So, as you can see, this has all been an early second millennium phenomenon. But if we go a bit further into the second millennium and find one of the end points, so this is Sumerian agriculture in modern day Iraq, and after this period, you get these rich civilizations, and you also have texts. And the interesting thing about the texts is you learn about a number of things. You learn about the management of the beginnings of management of the low level river, so you can move down from the foothills into the river. You also learn things about the crops that are used and when they were sown. And here is a colleague of mine has transliterated this one, Nick Posgate. Here's a very interesting one, a Sumerian fertility song of around 4,000 years ago. I would go with you to my large field, I would go with you to my small field, to my early grain, irrigated with its early water, and to my late grain, irrigated with its late water. And the two things about it is, one is they're controlling the water, and they're also growing grains in different seasons. And if one looks at how they're doing that, well, one of those grains is growing at the right time. It's a local crop that is triggered by the seasons and growing at the right time. The late grain needs to be one of these exotic crops with all its genes switched off, otherwise it won't grow in this invented season. So the exotic crops with their genes switched off allows multiple cropping, basically, and the multiple cropping underpins the complex society that leads to other things like water management, irrigation, and so forth. And you get something similar going on if you go into the later periods in China, in that you get this, this is just the god of agriculture, Shimong, over here, but you get these Wugu traditions, these 5-grain traditions, and the actual 5 grains in the 5-grain tradition are not always the same grains, but they always are a combination of local grains and exotic grains. And there aren't texts as early as the Sumerian texts, but nonetheless, once you get texts from oracle bones onwards that talk about crops, again what you see is an interest in the season of growth and the possibility of multiple cropping through the year. So I think that really gives us a shift where we can see not just the globalization amongst ordinary farmers, but the consequences. And what I've separated here is a sort of Neolithic agrarian world and a Bronze Age, Iron Age agrarian world. And in the Neolithic, you just have local grains, and so you just have single season farming. In other seasons, they're fowling, fishing, doing something or other, but you just have one season of agriculture, and it's happening on rain-fed foothills in intensively managed plots. In the Bronze Age and Iron Age, you have this mixture of local and exotic crops, which allows multiple season cropping in large permanent fields, and this goes best with extensive water mammals. And another, I haven't talked about it, but another interesting thing about it is that in this early period, animals are used as meat, and we can see that from the animal bone evidence. Here, animals are moved for secondary products. That's very visible in things like using them for wool and for milk, but also significantly in this intensification for traction and for pulling ploughs and cultivation equipment. And something else which is quite interesting, for those of you interested in the Anthropocene, the early period seems to connect chronologically with a rise in CO2, and the later period connects with the first rise in methane, and that makes sense in terms of the ecology of all that. So the food globalization period is a very interesting early globalization between ordinary, materially poor farmers in the foothills across Eurasia, but its consequences are to lay the foundation of a new form of complex agriculture that underpinned a different form of society that was intensive, hierarchical, and produced what we think of as the civilizations of prehistory. And finally, here are my, and those describe that as the domestication of the seasons. But finally, here are a number of the people that did the work, and some of my colleagues and the funding sources. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones, for that absolutely fascinating talk. The talk really used very genetical evidence to rethink the way crops, the transfer of crops from east to west and vice versa. And also I noticed that in the talk, Professor Jones also related to other subjects. For example, the fact that the use of using forks and perhaps chopsticks began with the consumption of sticky glutinous grains. That's the most interesting thing you hear. I think from later periods people have different theories about the use of chopsticks, but it's a very, very interesting archaeological find. Now I think I'd like to open the floor to questions. Do we have anyone who would like to ask any questions, comments about the talk today? Okay, yeah. And then we'll get you a microphone.
Because I just only watch a lot of programs, TV programs about archaeology, and maybe it is maybe I'm wrong. I just think that it maybe is not the people who just do the globalization. Maybe it's the continent itself. Maybe it is the maybe like I see a lot of programs they say about the original of the continents. They're actually one continent, and they split it into other places, so that you can also explain that the genetics are just similar. Just that they all come from one place and the continent just split and it becomes like that. And maybe there are really people already living before the continent split. Because maybe like the classic of the mountains and seas, like there are really some more people before that thing, but we cannot just prove that. Is that possible?
Well, I want to develop your very interesting point, because there's two things to say. One is, if one takes that story of continental drift, that's on a different time scale to the time scale I have been talking about. So the story of continental drift is on a much deeper time scale, than say the 4,000 or 5,000 years I've been talking about. But nonetheless, your underlying point that the planet and the geology have not been static is a very important one. And if one thinks about what geological changes do fit with the timescales I've been talking about, one major change is the sea level has gone up and down. And one thing us archaeologists need to always remember is in some places the coast is way out in recent time, and in certain parts of the world, certain things that are now islands were connected with the mainland. So if I slightly adjust your point to being aware of how geology is not static, that's a very good point. And if I can connect it to another thing about which is sort of geology is I think it's really important in understanding these landscapes to understand what we think of as a big river now is very different from a big river then. And so if we see a big river now, it's got embanked sides and the sides are in one place. There aren't lions roaming around the side. I mean, well, that's quite significant. The key thing about big rivers in the Neolithic is they were seasonal, moving around, and dangerous places. And in those classic narratives of the big river civilization, it's the wrong sort of river. So the general point you make is geology is not static, is an important one. It just happens that the continental drift isn't the example that fits in the chronology. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Jerry.
Well, sure, to follow up on that, you haven't mentioned climate change and the influence that it had. Could you mention what went on?
Yeah, in fact, if one takes that the work with Fahu Chen and Lanzhou, Fahu's main interest actually is the climatology, and maybe I should. Yeah.
There was some climate information. The graph.
Yeah. So this one. So the way this one worked is that Fahu's principal interest was this curve, and to follow the point, this is quite a significant drop in temperature here, and it's one of a number of climatic shifts in this period. And the interesting thing about it is that as the climate drops, the movement up altitude is enhanced. So I mean that's kind of interesting. And if one tracks back to each of the crops that forms this story, the process of their domestication is in a number of places coupled with significant fluctuations in the climate, for example, the Younger Dryas. So in the early stage of the domestication story, you get those climate couplings. But as you can see here, there isn't something where there isn't a link between where there are links between climate change and this episode of globalization, but they're kind of surprising, as you can see in this diagram.
The microphone. Yeah. Just use the microphone, please.
Thanks. This is a fascinating talk, and I learned a lot. So my question is, the pattern here are mostly cereal crops. Have you investigated the cash crops? So from my understanding, like the travel of cash crops across the globe come across really in a later stage and may follow.
What type of cash crops?
Like cotton, coffee, something like that.
Well, that's a very interesting question because and it's a very astute point. If I can move forward to the earliest textual evidence, which is essentially around 2,000 years old in both the East and the West, on the lists you get in texts of crops that are moving, the majority we would regard as cash crops of some form. So they aren't staple. You know, from the earlier from that as I say, about 2,000 years. You know, hand records and classical records. There are things we would regard as you know, spices and non-staples moving around. In terms of, that's a different form of evidence. It's textual evidence as opposed archaeobotanical evidence. In terms of archaeobotanical evidence, it's important in relation to your question to say that if you look at the charred evidence, it is inherently biased towards cereal crops. So if you burn a lot of what's in the kitchen, then the cereal grains remain identifiable. So yeah, exactly. So what one can't use that. But the thing that is interesting is if you go to another form of preservation, and that's desiccation. Desiccation preserves everything. And if one looks, as I mentioned, there are a number of sites in West China, in the Taklamakan Desert, in which you have, which is part of this story, so you have desiccated remains, and in those, it's not purely cereals. And one of the interesting plants, actually, for those who are interested in Chinese medicine, is ephedra, which is mahuang. And there are at the same date as those wheat grains, I found ephedra preserved within sites like Jiaohe, which is in Xinjiang. So I think it's an interesting point. I mean, at the moment, what I wanted to stress is that the early evidence is for the staples, but there are limits to the evidence. The other thing one can say actually is I don't know whether we regard fruits as cash crops. The two things that come in earlier that aren't grains, although not as early as the grains, are one, fruit seeds, so apples and peaches are part of this story, and the other one is cannabis, which is both, as you know, a psychoactive plant, and also it's a multi-purpose plant. It has a useful oil, a drug, and fibre. So I think there's stuff to find out, but nonetheless, the staple crops are a significant part of the story.
Thank you. I was wondering about that big blue line in the explosion and the idea of the crops going from small farmer to small farmer. And of course, you can't get into people's heads. But I was wondering, is there any evidence that it seems to have been deliberate, like, hey, sharing with the neighbor, or through, say, dowry or things like that? Or is it more sort of volunteers, wild plants sowing and just kind of moving?
No. I mean, I think it has to be human agency, and you've mentioned exactly the right word in terms of dowry. Not in as much as there's evidence is that if you reconstruct the ecology of these communities, then marriage partners is going to be a significant driver to why they're socializing. So if I can give you an answer which in places is rather evidence-free, if I can put it that way, I imagine that you, well, I mean, in parts it's not evidence-free, in parts it is evidence-free, but if one imagines in those foothills communities that are semi-mobile, they've got sheep and so forth. I haven't talked, there's a whole bunch of different evidence about the animals, but they've got sheep, and if they're working with millet, it's a plant that can go from seed to seed in 60 days, and so they might be splitting up and leaving a couple of teenagers in one place while the millet's growing, you know what I mean? And they are going to, if one puts together their lives, then ecologically it's fine, but reproductively they do need to, the main driver of their socializing is in relation to issues like dowry and so forth. I mean, we've, as well as doing the crops, we've looked at some other aspects that might explore how they're exchanging ideas. And one of the interesting ones is the pottery. When Anderson and Foley did the pottery back in the 20s, they came up with this Eurocentric story, which fit at the time. And once archaeologists were moving away from those particular stories, there's been quite a resistance to look at global patterns in something aesthetic like pottery production. But I've actually got one of my students at the moment is trying to make. She's just finishing her PhD, looking at those pottery connections. Not so much in the idea as one is derived from the other, but there could be ideas flowing around between them. And it is quite interesting that if you start looking at how the pottery is made, one can imagine ideas flowing in that way. So, I mean, I really suspect that socialization is really important. The other interesting thing about it is, again, to pile one model on another, there's also within the human studies both of human genetic diversity and how the humans are moving around, and also how the languages are moving around. And if you start looking at the pattern of how far these contexts are being made, then it's reasonable to suppose that they're on a bit of a steep linguistic gradient. So as those socializations happen, the linguistic diversity they're crossing is reasonably steep. And the thing that I really like to explore, but I'm not quite sure how to do it, is it'd be really interesting to explore game playing in the context. There's some, I mean, there's if you look east, I mean, when we looked at the crops, there's masses of stuff we can do in terms of genetics and so forth. But in terms of other similarities, I mean, the checkerboard games actually occur quite early, both in the East and West. And if there was some way, by some linguistic analogy or something, that one could actually explore game playing, I think that would be really interesting. So a lot of evidence-free foundation to my answer, but it's more to say you're asking a very interesting question.
Okay, well, thank you.
Any other questions, or do you have anyone to raise a question? I think I'd like to ask. I'd like to ask a question. Actually, the rate of exchange. Today we think of transfers going. You get on an aeroplane, you take wherever you're going, you put out your mobile telephone and communicate with someone. So was this sort of going, the tidal wave that came down the Hershey corridor in 800 BC, was it a sudden wave, or was it going in fits and starts? What is the do you have some idea of the level of
I think there's two things about it. That isotopic effect is where did it come? I don't remember what it was. Oh yeah, that one there. I mean, I think the truth of the matter is that is the data. You can see in other words, I mean, I wouldn't want to overplay how much I can give you an answer to that. I say there's two things about it. The tidal wave is an interesting phenomenon which we need to look at. Underpinning that, including for the wheat and barley, if one moves away from that to the earliest records on either side, then there are earlier records for wheat and barley, and they correspond more to the middle. If you look at how those earliest records of wheat and barley are moving east and the millet moving west, in terms of human biographies, you can connect them to a slow process.
A slow process.
In terms of archaeological timescales, we can make it look fast.
I see.
But in terms of the question you're asking, then there can be a number of generations involved, if you see what I mean.
I say yes. It could be both glacial and
very fast. So I think I pull out this effect as overlaying something else that's going on, and a kind of interesting one. But.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah.
Exceptionally interesting. Are there any other questions, comments, or something you'd like to ask about the talk? Please, Charles.
Thank you, Professor Jones, for your very interesting talk. You used the term globalization in your talk. You know, the globalization has become a very important scholarly, one of the foci of scholarly research in recent decades. And it seems to us when we mention globalization, we find that the world is becoming more unified, or becoming one. So, but I have discovered that when you talk about the globalization in prehistory, you make a very interesting observation that while crops move around, but culinary tradition persists.
Yeah.
So does this mean that these days natural resources move around? Also, technologies also can be transferred from one place to another place. But does culture also change with this? I mean, does the world actually really becoming one? So I just want...
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, you're absolutely right that culinary evidence is providing an answer no. And but nonetheless, I think an interesting thing about this is the unanticipated consequences. So I always think the answer is the sentient answer is no. The unanticipated consequent answer is yes. In that, I mean, if I can always imagine a world where all of these communities are saying, I want my dinner like Mum cooked it, and that's really kind of sticking through. And without realising it, the new crops they're bringing in and they're turning into how Mum cooked it. They're changing their lives in a way whereby the global connectivity is happening in spite of that. I think it gets back on something about timescale. I mean, it gets really. I mean, that's something that we've as archaeologists we've often been a bit careless about. We're really obsessed with time, and we haven't paid enough attention to tempo. And as I say, one can present some things as synchronous, but it's really important to distinguish between experience time and to slot. How would this be experienced within lifetimes, and what its consequences for even something like 150 years? And I would say at the lifetime level, it's happening within a cultural conservatism, even though it's unfolding into things that are changing dramatically.
Yes, thank you. I think before I close the session this afternoon, I think I'd like to, we will make a presentation to Professor Jones. The university has a very good collection of Western maps, which our colleagues and students should all know about, but not everyone seems to know about. So if you would like to see them, most of them, not all of them, have been digitalized. So I think to mark the, to commemorate Professor Jones's visit to us, I think I'd like to call upon the University librarian, Diana Chan, to present a map, a reproduction of a map to Professor Jones.
Because of the 25th anniversary, we printed them, and we have 3 series, and this is the World Series.
Ah.
Yeah, so 4. Yeah, we show the audience as well.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
Okay, I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you. What I'll do is I won't try and hold all of this, but I'd like to turn them so we can see the different maps.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, that's marvelous.
Marco can give you
yes,
detailed.
Well, these are much more. Having heard Marco bring these maps to life, this is. Oh, and this one. This one is wonderful.
You're welcome to come and visit the special collection.
Oh yeah.
No, this one.
This one. I will think of Marco every time I. This was one of the high points in Marco's talk.
Because of the monsters at the side.
Yeah, that's beautiful. But there we have a really interesting map of a lot of the areas that are relevant to
Yeah, the old world.
Yeah, and I'll study closely to see whether they've got the foothills right.
Well,
But that's a wonderful souvenir of this of the visit, and can I take also the opportunity to thank you for your really stimulating questions that have also helped me. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. 1, 2, 1 more. Okay.
Okay.
1, 2.
That's great.
Okay, thank you very much for attending the talk this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.